SBO is the best.
All sport is really just a different mix of three things: how fast you need ATP, how long you need it for, and how well you can recover between efforts. If you understand that, you understand energy systems. By the end of this, you should be able to explain the aerobic system, including glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, beta oxidation, and the electron transport chain. You should also be able to explain the anaerobic systems, which are the ATP-PC system and the anaerobic glycolytic system. You'll be able to explain oxygen deficit, EPOC, lactate threshold, and OBLA in plain English. And you'll be able to explain VO2 max, how it is measured, and how different training methods improve energy systems. Let's start with the foundation of the whole topic. ATP is the only directly usable form of energy in the body. That means no matter what sport you do, whether it's sprinting, swimming, tackling, jumping, or throwing, your muscles are powered by ATP. ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. It stores energy in its phosphate bonds. When ATP is broken down, energy is released, and that energy is used for muscle contraction. So every single movement you make depends on ATP being available. The problem is this: your body only stores a very small amount of ATP. So if you want to keep moving, your body has to keep resynthesizing ATP again and again and again. And this is where the energy systems come in. Think of ATP like a phone battery that drains almost instantly during exercise. Your body needs chargers. It has three main chargers. The ATP-PC system is the instant charger. Anaerobic glycolysis is the fast charger. And the aerobic system is the slower charger, but it can keep going for much longer and produce much more ATP overall. So the real question in sport is not whether ATP is used. ATP is always used. The real question is, which energy system is doing most of the ATP resynthesis at that moment? Now let's move to the aerobic energy system. The aerobic system is the long-duration engine. It works best when enough oxygen is available. It is slower to respond than the anaerobic systems, but it has a very large capacity, meaning it can produce a lot of ATP over time. That makes it vital for lower intensity, longer duration activity. So if you think about a long-distance run, a steady cycle, or the general work rate during a full game over a long period, the aerobic system is hugely important. At A level, you need to know the main stages of the aerobic system. These are glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, beta oxidation, and the electron transport chain. Let's go through them one by one. First, glycolysis. Glycolysis is the first stage of breaking down glucose. It happens in the cell fluid, also called the cytoplasm. In simple terms, glucose is split into smaller molecules. One key point here is that glycolysis can happen whether oxygen is available or not. That's why it appears in both aerobic and anaerobic pathways. If oxygen is available, the products of glycolysis can continue deeper into aerobic metabolism. If oxygen is not available in sufficient amounts, then the body relies more on anaerobic pathways instead. So glycolysis is like the first gateway. It starts the process. Next is the Krebs cycle, also called the citric acid cycle. This happens in the mitochondria. The mitochondria are often described as the powerhouse of the cell, and for good reason. The Krebs cycle acts like a processing hub. It helps break down the fuel further and produces carrier molecules. Those carrier molecules are incredibly important because they move to the next stage, where most of the ATP is actually made. That next stage is the electron transport chain. This is one of the biggest ideas in the topic. The electron transport chain, often shortened to ETC, is where the majority of ATP is produced during aerobic respiration. Again, this takes place in the mitochondria. The carrier molecules from earlier stages feed into the chain. Through a series of reactions, a gradient is created, and this drives ATP production. So if you want a simple, exam-friendly way to remember it, the electron transport chain is the stage with the big ATP output. Now let's add beta oxidation. Beta oxidation is how the body breaks down fat for energy. This becomes especially important at lower intensities and over longer durations. When exercise is not extremely intense, the body has more time and enough oxygen to use fat as a major fuel source. Beta oxidation breaks fatty acids down into smaller units that can enter aerobic pathways and contribute to ATP production. This is why fat is such an important fuel for endurance work. So an excellent A-level application point is this. At lower intensities, aerobic metabolism can rely more on fats through beta oxidation, helping support long-duration performance. That is exactly the kind of line that shows understanding in an exam. Now let's move to the anaerobic energy systems. Anaerobic means energy is being produced without enough oxygen to fully meet the demand. Thus, systems dominate when exercise intensity is high, and ATP has to be resynthesized very quickly. AQA splits the anaerobic systems into two. First, the ATP-PC system. Second, the anaerobic glycolytic system. Let's start with the ATP-PC system, also known as the phosphagen system. This is the fastest way to resynthesize ATP. It is dominant during very short, explosive efforts, usually around 0 to 8 or maybe 10 seconds of all-out work. It works using phosphocreatine, often shortened to PC, which is stored in the muscles. Phosphocreatine donates a phosphate to ADP to rapidly remake ATP. That means ATP can be resynthesized almost instantly. This is why the ATP-PC system is perfect for explosive actions, like a sprint start, a jump, a throw, a heavy single lift, or a powerful tackle. Its strength is speed. It resynthesizes ATP at the highest rate, but its weakness is capacity. There is only a small amount of phosphocreatine stored in the muscles, so it runs out quickly. That means the ATP-PC system is brilliant for immediate power, but only for a short duration. Now let's look at the anaerobic glycolytic system. Once exercise continues beyond that first explosive burst, the body relies more on anaerobic glycolysis. This system breaks down glucose rapidly without enough oxygen to fully process it aerobically. It can still resynthesize ATP quite quickly, so it is essential during hard, intense exercise, but it comes with a cost. It is linked with the accumulation of fatiguing byproducts and rising blood lactate during intense work. That is why it is associated with discomfort, burning muscles, and a drop in performance if the effort continues. This system is especially important in events and actions like a 400-meter run, repeated sprints in football, prolonged intense pressing, and hard bursts during combat sports. So in simple terms, the ATP-PC system gives you the explosive start, and the anaerobic glycolytic system helps you keep working hard when the effort lasts longer than a few seconds, but not long enough to be mainly aerobic. Now let's tackle one of the most misunderstood parts of the topic: lactate accumulation, lactate threshold, and OBLA. As exercise intensity increases, the body produces more lactate. At lower and moderate intensities, lactate can be produced and cleared at a manageable rate. But as intensity rises further, a point is reached where lactate starts to accumulate faster than it can be removed. That point is called lactate threshold. So lactate threshold is the point where production begins to outpace clearance. That means lactate levels start rising more sharply in the blood. Now let's add OBLA, which stands for onset of blood lactate accumulation. This is commonly linked with a blood lactate concentration of around 4 millimoles per liter. In practical terms, OBLA is used as a marker in testing to indicate a significant rise in blood lactate. A very important exam nuance is this: lactate is not just useless waste. In real physiology, it is part of normal metabolism. But in A-level PE answers, you focus on the exam specification: lactate accumulation, lactate threshold, OBLA, and how they affect sprint and power performance. Now let's move to the energy continuum. This is a core concept. The energy continuum shows that all three energy systems work all the time. It is never just one system switched on and the others switched off. Instead, one system tends to dominate depending on the intensity and duration of the activity. That overlap is extremely important. Students often make the mistake of treating energy systems like separate boxes. They are not. They are overlapping contributors. For example, in the first few seconds of an all-out effort, the ATP-PC system dominates. As the effort continues, the anaerobic glycolytic system becomes more important, and over longer durations, the aerobic system becomes dominant. So imagine a timeline. At around 5 seconds of all-out work, ATP-PC is the main contributor. Around 30 seconds to 2 minutes, the anaerobic glycolytic system plays a much larger role. And by the time you get into longer duration exercise, such as 10 minutes, 60 minutes, or beyond, the aerobic system dominates. Now let's connect this to muscle fiber types, because this is where your answer starts sounding genuinely high level. Fast twitch fibers are built for high power output. They are better suited to explosive, high-intensity work. That means they rely more heavily on anaerobic pathways during maximal efforts. Slow twitch fibers are more fatigue-resistant. They are better suited to endurance work. That means they rely much more on aerobic metabolism. So if you link fiber type to the dominant energy system, you show real understanding. Let's now apply this to short-duration, high-intensity exercise, because AQA loves this. In short duration, high-intensity exercise, the anaerobic systems dominate. That means the ATP-PC system and the anaerobic glycolytic system are key. Take a 200-meter sprint as a simple example. At the start phase, the ATP-PC system is dominant because the athlete needs instant ATP for explosive acceleration. As the sprint continues, the anaerobic glycolytic system contributes more and more. Because the effort is still very intense, lactate production rises sharply. That means fatigue becomes a major issue. So performance in this kind of event depends on explosive power, rapid ATP resynthesis, and the ability to tolerate high levels of lactate-related fatigue. That is exactly the type of applied explanation examiners want. Now let's move to longer duration, lower intensity exercise, and look at oxygen consumption, oxygen deficit, and EPOC. First, oxygen deficit. At the start of exercise, the body's demand for ATP rises immediately, but the aerobic system does not respond instantly. It takes time for oxygen uptake to increase and match the demand. That means at the beginning of exercise, some ATP has to be supplied by anaerobic systems while the aerobic system catches up. That early gap between the oxygen required and the oxygen actually being used is called oxygen deficit. A simple way to picture it is this. The body needs oxygen instantly, but oxygen uptake rises gradually. That gap at the start is oxygen deficit. Now let's go to recovery. After exercise stops, oxygen uptake does not immediately return to resting levels. It stays elevated for a period of time. This is called excess post-exercise oxygen consumption, or EPOC. In simple terms, the body keeps using extra oxygen after exercise to recover. Why? Because it is restoring the body to its resting state. That includes replenishing high-energy phosphates, like phosphocreatine, helping with recovery processes, and returning systems back towards normal. A key point here is that EPOC tends to be larger after harder or longer exercise. So the more intense or demanding the session, the bigger the recovery demand afterwards. Now let's move to one of the most important performance indicators in endurance sport. VO2 max. VO2 max is the maximum rate at which the body can take in, transport, and use oxygen during intense exercise. In short, it is a measure of aerobic power. The higher the VO2 max, the greater the athlete's capacity for sustained aerobic work. At A level, one of the most valuable things you can use here is the Fick equation. The Fick equation is VO2 equals Q multiplied by the arteriovenous oxygen difference. Let's break that down. Q means cardiac output. Cardiac output is heart rate multiplied by stroke volume, so that is how much blood the heart pumps. The arteriovenous oxygen difference refers to how much oxygen the muscles extract from the blood. So the equation tells us that VO2 max depends on two big things. First, how much oxygen-rich blood can be delivered to the muscles. Second, how effectively the muscles can extract and use that oxygen. This gives you a powerful way to structure an exam answer. If the question asks what affects VO2 max, split your answer into central and peripheral factors. Central factors are things like stroke volume and cardiac output. Peripheral factors are things like the muscle's ability to extract oxygen. That is a very high-level way to answer. Now let's look at how energy expenditure and related variables are measured, because AQA names specific methods. The first is indirect calorimetry. Indirect calorimetry estimates energy expenditure by measuring oxygen consumption and carbon dioxide production. Because aerobic metabolism depends heavily on oxygen use, measuring oxygen and carbon dioxide gives insight into how much energy the body is expending. The second is RER, which stands for respiratory exchange ratio. RER is the ratio of carbon dioxide produced to oxygen consumed. It is used to help infer which fuel source is being used during exercise, such as whether the body is relying more on fats or carbohydrates. The third method is lactate sampling. Lactate threshold testing often involves taking small blood samples during an incremental exercise test. As the intensity increases, blood lactate is measured. This helps identify the point where lactate begins rising more rapidly, which can indicate lactate threshold or help estimate OBLA. The fourth is the VO2 max test. This is usually a graded exercise test. That means the workload gradually increases until the performer reaches exhaustion. During the test, oxygen uptake is measured. This allows practitioners to identify the maximum rate of oxygen uptake, which is the person's VO2 max. Now let's finish with the impact of specialist training methods on energy systems, because AQA specifically lists these. First, altitude training. Altitude training exposes the body to lower oxygen levels. In response, the body can increase erythropoietin, often shortened to EPO, that can stimulate increases in red blood cell production and hemoglobin mass. More hemoglobin can improve oxygen transport. So when the athlete returns to sea level, this can support endurance performance by improving the ability to deliver oxygen to working muscles. Second, HIIT, which stands for High Intensity Interval Training. HIIT involves repeated hard efforts with planned recovery periods. This type of training is extremely effective because it can improve aerobic fitness, including VO2 max, while also developing anaerobic performance qualities. Why? Because it trains the body to repeatedly produce high power, recover, and then produce high power again. That makes it brilliant for sports with repeated intense efforts. Third, plyometrics. Plyometric training involves explosive jumping and rebounding actions. It is heavily anaerobic and relies strongly on the phosphagen system for rapid ATP resynthesis. Its main effect is improving explosive performance qualities, such as power and reactive strength. So while it may not directly target aerobic endurance, it is highly relevant for short, explosive actions. Fourth, SAQ training, which means speed, agility, and quickness. SAQ training is associated with improvements in sprinting speed and change of direction ability. These qualities depend heavily on rapid ATP resynthesis and repeated high-intensity efforts. So SAQ is especially relevant to sports where athletes need to accelerate, decelerate, and change direction quickly and repeatedly. Now let's bring everything together in one strong recap. ATP is the immediate energy source for muscle contraction. Because ATP stores are very limited, the body must constantly resynthesize ATP through different energy systems. The aerobic system is used mainly for longer duration, lower intensity work and includes glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, beta oxidation, and the electron transport chain. It is slower to respond, but has a very large capacity and produces a high ATP yield. The ATP-PC system dominates very short explosive efforts. It resynthesizes ATP at the fastest rate, but only for a short time because phosphocreatine stores are limited. The anaerobic glycolytic system supports high-intensity efforts that last longer than the initial explosive phase. It can resynthesize ATP quickly, but it is linked with rising lactate and fatigue. As exercise intensity increases, lactate production rises. Once production exceeds removal, lactate begins to accumulate more rapidly. This is linked to lactate threshold, and OBLA is commonly used as a marker of significant blood lactate accumulation. The energy continuum shows that all energy systems are always working, but one tends to dominate depending on intensity and duration. Oxygen deficit explains why anaerobic systems contribute at the start of exercise before oxygen uptake catches up. EPOC explains why oxygen use stays elevated after exercise during recovery. VO2 max is a measure of maximum aerobic power. It can be explained using the Fick equation, which links it to cardiac output and the muscle's ability to extract oxygen. And finally, training methods like altitude training, HIIT, plyometrics, and SAQ can each improve different parts of energy system performance depending on the demands of the sport. Okay, that's it for this video. For more high-quality PE revision, visit www.superpeonline.com, the best PE educational platform in the world, built by students and teachers for precision. See you in the next video.